Dear friends, welcome to you all. I just want to welcome Frau Joas. Very good to have you with us, and to welcome His Excellency the Ambassador of Austria to the Holy See, Markus Bergmann. Benvenuto. I'm honored and delighted as the president of the John Paul II Institute to welcome all of you for this evening of reflection and dialogue. Listening here in Rome at the John Paul II Institute to Professor Hans Joas, who teaches in Berlin and in Chicago, is quite an event, and I want to express him my warm-hearted gratitude. This event takes place in a larger event, which is the Visiting Professors Week. In fact, this whole week, Professor Joas carefully and patiently introduced us, and I want to welcome also the colleagues and the doctoral students. Professor Joas introduced us carefully and patiently into his lifelong research on the transformations of the sacred in modernity. With a marvelous sense of pedagogy, he showed that the sacred has not disappeared in a secular age. For us, coming from different cultures, from all over the world, he opened our eyes anew to the diverse experiences we have of the sacred today. Therefore, he also drew our attention on the changing and subtle way power can interact and merge with the sacred. Professor Joas helped us to grow in critical consciousness, in responsibility towards the possible fusion between the power and the sacred. He has also fostered our ability to choose and promote models of the sacred that renounce to a perverse exercise of power. Professor Joas spoke this morning of the transpolitical sacralization. He said it was the first time he used this expression. I like this. It really means that teaching is not repeating. It is really discovering, and we discover together. As Christians and as theologians, we shall benefit from his sociological and anthropological inputs for a long time. We gain something that is most important in research, the desire to read and to read more and to read better. Professor Joas has written numerous books, as you know. For us, he accepted to reread some of them so that we could enter more easily in them. This is why I said that we would benefit from his teaching for a long time. Please applaud him. It's really from... The other visiting professor, whom we'll have the pleasure to listen to in a few minutes also, is Professor Marco Gallo. He teaches in Italy, in Fossano, in Torino, but also in Paris, France. He's a young, talented, and promising liturgist. He also opened our eyes in a different way, starting from the common experience we have of Christian celebrations. He explained that what we consider as a very special field of sacredness is in fact made of secular elements that have been reorganized throughout history to become relevant expressions of faith in a changing world. The liturgy, he said, should be approached as a set of actions for persons in community, some of which receive a ministry that helps the whole assembly to celebrate actively the mystery of the presence of the risen Christ. Here also, we have been carefully and patiently accompanied by Professor Gallo to re-evaluate the hidden alliance of the sacred and the power so that we may become more conscious of the equal dignity of all the baptized and more inclined to fight against all forms of spiritual abuse that can invade the field of the liturgy. For this, I wish we can thank him. I just wanted to give an echo to what our two visiting professors have been doing for us since the beginning of this week. It is now time to give space to their public address and dialogue. This event is hosted by our chair Gaudium et Spes, presided by Professor Sequeri, and it is sustained by Banca Intesa São Paulo. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Grazie, Professor Bourdain. Desidero anch'io salutare voi tutti.
Thank you, Professor Bourdain. I too wish to greet you all and welcome you all to this public conference during the visiting professors' classes. And I want to thank visiting professors also on behalf of all the participants in this week. First and foremost, the students and the doctorants, especially the doctorants, the PhD students who are taking part in this very important course for the life of the Institute. I also wish to greet and welcome the many people who are online and are listening to us on the live streaming on YouTube. Simultaneous translation into English and into Italian is available. You can either use the QR code that you have in front of us or use the link that you have received by email. The power of the sacred in the secular age, faith and values. This was the title picked for the public conference this afternoon. It's meant to spread towards the outside, to everyone, our considerations in these days, together with Professors Ioas and Gallo. Let me limit myself to just a few introductory remarks before I hand this over to them. The context in which we are going to be discussing the relationship between power and the sacred is the so-called scene of the secular age. Secularization, therefore, is the framework. I'm not saying the historical, but the hermeneutical framework where we place our considerations this afternoon. Secularization as an interpretive theory of reality, or better still, secularization as a set of theories and doctrines that often are conflicting concerning the state of religions and societies undergoing transformation. Secularization is not only an attempt to interpret a historical process or an era such as modernity. At the same time, what is contained in the theories of secularization is not only a diagnostic gesture through which we try to interpret certain social changes or the ailments that beset a given period of history. In its basic formulation, in its zero expression or formula, secularization was described as a theorem, a sort of law that can be applied to the body social of historical civilizations. The stronger socialization, the weaker is religion. In more modernized societies, religious beliefs and practices tend to become weaker and disappear. We know full well that this interpretive proposal is fraught with problems and doubts because technological innovations coexist with the comeback of the sacred and a revival of communities of faith. At any rate, there is still one extant doubt that is that troubles us very much. That is the idea that in actual fact, through the category of secularization, we are not trying to study religions as much as modernization. There is a tension, there is a recurrent concern, sometimes hidden, sometimes obsessive, concerning the uses of the term secularization. What troubles us is not so much the state of health of religions and faiths, but rather what we do as while we say we are modernizing, what we do while we are modernizing, what is the quality of the gesture, what is the mental intention animating our wish for modernity, for ever more modern societies, work contexts, more modern universities. In other terms, what is truly going through our minds when we say that we want more modern models of development? What do we really mean today by the expressions modern politics or modern policies? I want to use a metaphor by Jose Casanova and say that the impression is that what is exploding is not the supernova of religions, but the supernova of modernization. In other terms, we are living and thinking in the nebula of faith and new forms of spirituality, but also within the galaxy of new approaches to modernization. By modernizing, we have built worlds and we have destroyed worlds. We have founded or laid the foundations for civil coexistence, but we've also jeopardized the conditions of habitability of our common home, the planet. In order to modernize, we have often used the power of the sacred and the sacrality of power. But perhaps the hottest, the most thorny issue is whether it is right today to remain within the sphere of the modern or bide very well to the posture of those who want to modernize at all costs. Have we really arrived at the threshold of an axial change where what is at play is the notion itself of world as modern or modernized world? How can we accept the invitation by Bruno Latour, who says that now that we have modernized, we need to ecologize? Climate change and its attendant challenges may be pushing us to a new symbolic set where modernize will mean new, unseen, unheard of things. Well, in order to do all this, we don't need a mere verification of powers. We need to probe the gestures of power, probe the lowest levels of human experience, where the use of power is constantly at risk of turning into abuse of power. So we need to study those experiences where the exercise of roles and functions of power become perverted sometimes. We need to understand modernization again, but not only that, and we need to rethink political theology, but also we need to rethink biopolitics. In other terms, to reread the biopower in light of the devices by which the social and political institutions of modernity have impersonally controlled and manufactured bodies. As we look at the work ahead, we might think of biopolitics, but also speak of biopotestas, biopower, in other terms, to reflect on the power to influence the people's lives in looking at personal power roles and not only the impersonal power structures. Biopotestas does not concern the study of a device, but the functions of guidance, of orientation, of teaching, as they are enacted in the exercise of personal power. In Roman law, Potestas is the way that we place power in connection with the other, with what is external to what is outside. So in the exercise of potestas, the various powers regulate each other and enable the subject to be in possible relationships. The power of potestas may promote or jeopardize lives. It is the power to open or close the flow of life itself. Potestas, as exercised through certain social and religious roles, may then pollute and drain the sources of the life of one or more people. I'll now hand this over directly to Professor Hans Joas, who will now start the presentations this afternoon. Professor Joas has been introduced by Professor Bourdain, and we are eager to listen to him. His topic will be transcendence and attachment to values, the power of the sacred.
First of all, I would like to thank our president for the very warm words, both of welcome and, let's say, the expression of gratitude for what has already taken place in the course of the week. And I would also like to thank the Austrian ambassador for being here. And I realize that he's coming instead of the German ambassador, and that the possible explanation for that is that a Bavarian Catholic like me, originally is maybe in some cultural sense closer to Austria than to the rest of Germany. Now, in the 20 minutes or so I think I have to balance between two things. On the one hand, I see several people here who have taken the class. And on the other hand, I see many unknown faces. So people who were not here in the course of the week. So I don't want to be boring to those who were here, but also, I mean, a little bit informative for those who have come here for the first time now. So I will very briefly summarize the main contents of my teaching and then add certain things that could be of interest for those who have not taken the class. So first, in my teaching this week, I mostly focused on three topics that I will very briefly enumerate and summarize now. First, an appropriate understanding of what we mean when we say the sacred, and of the human experiences and the social processes out of which the feeling that we have encountered something sacred emerge. That was, let's say, Monday and parts of Tuesday. Then the connection between the sacred and power, and particularly political power. This not in the form of a world history of the relationships between religion and the state, or religion and politics, because that would not be possible in so short a time, but in the form of a typology of the main forms of the fusion of sacredness and power. For example, in the sacralization of kings or emperors or rulers in general, or in the sacralization of nations, as I think it is so crucial for the history of nationalism, modern nationalism of 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. And third, the search for a reference point beyond the sacralizations of power. And this, at least in my presentation, has taken on two forms, namely, on the one hand, but they are connected with each other. On the one hand, the sacralization of all human beings in the sense of identifying something like a sacred core of all human beings, what I call, following the French sociologist Émile Durkheim, the sacredness of the person. That's a kind of sociological way to say universal human dignity. All human beings have the same quality in that sense. And on the other hand, the search for a reference point that goes beyond mundane phenomena of power. And that was the point of transcendence in a rather ambitious sense. I say that because, for example, in the sociology of religion, some people use transcendence just in the sense of going beyond this particular moment. Whereas here, transcendence has a strong metaphysical meaning of a reference to something that is clearly not simply of this world. So these were the three main areas of my lectures, of my presentations. And I add that the background for all that, of course, is, and there is a certain overlap with what Professor Rosito just said, the critique of the secularization thesis in the sense of modernization leading automatically to a decline of religion. So I think the critique, to which I certainly also have contributed, but others have written more important things on that. The critique, you could say, is over now in the sense of it was relatively successful, that there are only few proponents of the conventional secularization thesis still around. There are some, but clearly a smaller minority among historians and among sociologists. But critique is not enough. We need an alternative theory, so to speak. Not an alternative theory of secularization, but an alternative theory of sacralization and the relationships between the sacred and political power. So, for example, last year I gave a talk in Munich that was called the Voegelin Lecture. Do you know Erich Voegelin? Vogelin, the Americans say, yeah. Famous, originally German, then American, historian and so on, everything of religion, political scientist. And the title of that, what comes after the secularization thesis? So what can replace the secularization thesis? And now, so much on the ground already covered in the course. Now, I would like to give you some information about my writings in the last year and my current project, because what I'm writing is a three-volume work, of which the first and the 2 volumes are out, and the 3rd volume is in preparation. The first volume is this book, The Power of the Sacred, that some of you are aware of, published in 2017, out in English and French translations, and Spanish and even Hungarian translation are coming. And that is an attempt to demonstrate empirically why one of the most influential narratives in the history of religion, namely the Max Weberian narrative of a world historical process of disenchantment as the preparation for modern European secularization, why this is not plausible, why this is not convincing. To put it in extremely superficial terms, it is an attempt to show why the assumption that religion is about to disappear is not correct, even if it may become weaker and weaker in certain European countries. But why at least the assumption that there is an inner necessity of this process is not correct, that we have to study instead certain contingencies of European history in the 18th, 19th, 20th century to understand why secularization is so important in Europe, but that also then allows us to rethink what will happen in other parts of the world and what may be the future of Europe in this regard will be. Now, the second volume that came out in German in 2020 and is already translated into English, but not yet published in English, deals with a second major narrative in the same area. And again, to put it in the most simplistic terms, it is not the narrative that religion is about to disappear and that it is a good thing if it disappears. That would be the secularization thesis. But that religion is not about to disappear, but that religion remaining with us is mostly a danger for political freedom, for democracy and human rights. So there's a huge discourse why Islam is such a danger, or why Catholicism may still be a danger, and so on. And the most important proponents of this narrative think that religion will not disappear, but this is a dangerous thing, with very few exceptions in the area of religion, or maybe mostly only with one exception, and that is Protestant Christianity. So they are opposed to all forms of religion, some of them to such an extent that they prefer not calling their own Protestant Christianity a religion at all. If I remember correctly, Professor Sequeri alluded to that in his introductory speech on Monday, denying that this is a religion, so to speak. We have the true faith, the others have religion. There are other Protestant theologians like Paul Tillich, for example, who contradicted that and said we would not even understand how people experience Jesus if they had not had religion before, so to speak. But I can leave that aside. But in the second volume of the trilogy, I try to demonstrate why this Hegelian narrative, I introduce the name of Hegel now because I see Hegel as one of the arch representatives of this narrative, is also wrong. I don't have the time to repeat that or to present that, but the structure of the book is to say this is a narrative about the history of religion and its relevance for modern political freedom. So in the book, I discuss why Hegel's understanding of religion is wrong, why Hegel's understanding of history is wrong, and why Hegel's understanding of freedom is wrong. Or wrong is too easy, but you understand what insufficient or has its shortcomings. And the fourth part of the book then is about the Hegelian and the typically Protestant perspective on the global history of religion. Because this worldview or this narrative is extremely Eurocentric and, if I may invent the term, Christianocentric. The simplistic idea, so to speak, is the global history of religion leads to one form of highest religion, that is Christianity. And the history of Christianity leads to one form of highest Christianity, that is Protestantism. And then this Protestantism leads to modern political freedom somehow. And so in my argument, I try to show why these things are wrong and how our understanding of the global history of religion has to change. Just take the example of how China appears in Hegel's philosophy of history. I mean, if you can call it ridiculous, but you can also become angry at that, so to speak. It's just that many people who read that still are so Eurocentric themselves and so little informed about Chinese religious history themselves that they don't realize how distorting his presentation is. Okay, now in the third volume, of course, the one that I have not finished yet, and that may take the rest of the year at least. And of course, one should not accept such invitations like this one if one wants to finish earlier. But one also needs sources of motivation and the feeling that people are interested in what one is doing, and cannot simply totally withdraw to one's desk. The third volume is an attempt to give a theoretically informed basic structure of a global history of what I call moral universalism. Of course, not as a narration. I mean, nobody can tell the history of the whole world and in one volume, but in chapters that all deal with theoretically derived questions of crucial points in the global history of moral universalism. And I just mentioned a few of them, not all of them. These are 13. For example, how did moral universalism emerge? That has something to do with the question we were talking about this morning, axial age debates and so on. Or what happens when a moral universalism that has emerged in opposition to a certain political structure, for example, of an empire, becomes discovered by that empire as a kind of ideal ideology for the empire. You understand? And I decided to mention that we are here about 100 meters from a building that very much symbolizes such an appropriation of a religious version of moral universalism by an empire. San Giovanni in Laterano was not built as a church, but was taken from a Roman family, if I'm well informed, from a Roman family to turn it into a church by an emperor who had discovered Christianity also as a means for his power interests. I do not want to reduce it to that, but it clearly played a role in that. Jesus helps me to achieve military victories or more. And this is not just a one event thing here. But you could as well speak about, let's say, the relationship between Chinese emperors and Confucianism, for example. There is the expression imperial Confucianism in the literature about China. Or next such question, what happens to a religion of moral universalism when the empire that had appropriated that religion is about to collapse or collapses? For an audience of theologians, I probably just have to bring up the name of Augustine to say, I think we cannot understand Augustine apart from this constellation. Okay, I will not go through others, but just mention the 20th century cases that I'm dealing with. And I have written a series of lectures as so-called Nietzsche lecturer in Weimar, which is a bit strange in my case, but I accepted the invitation, about Gandhi, for example, as the mobilization of Indian spiritual traditions against the British Empire. So saying the British claim that the empire is justifiable in terms of moral universalism. They do that either in the language of Christianity or then in the language of civilizational superiority. And he does not say as some, let's say, post-colonial critics would say today, this makes clear that universalism is just an ideology of rulers. But he says this is a dishonest universalism, and we can develop a more honest, a more authentic universalism out of our own religious traditions. And this I find, extremely important for such a global history of moral universalism. Okay, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, and is another chapter, and Mao, and now you will be frightened by Mao, because I say the Cultural Revolution in China was the most aggressive, the most hostile movement against all religion in world history, and the attempt to replace all religion with something new, with something that cannot simply be called, let's say, a Chinese ideology or a particularism. It also has a universe, as all Marxism has a kind of universalist dimension also. I think I stop here and just concluding by saying a kind of outcome of such a complex theoretical and historical argument is that we live in a world with a plurality of moral universalisms, that Christianity does not have a monopoly here, and Christianity should not justify its own moral universalism by claiming a monopoly. There are Jewish forms of moral universalism, there are Buddhist forms of moral universalism, there are Confucian versions of moral universalism, and of course there are secular versions of moral universalism, let's say secular versions of Kantianism or Habermas's moral philosophy, and so on. And that we live in a world in which different versions of moral universalism coexist and can cooperate, and that it is a great challenge for the Catholic Church to rethink its own message and its own structures in terms of the demands of moral universalism, and to develop a willingness to form a coalition with other religious and non-religious forms of moral universalism. And that is the bridge to tomorrow's lecture about the church. Okay, thank you.
Grazie, Professor Joas.
Thank you, Professor Joas, for providing us with for giving us the honor and the opportunity to share in the building of your thinking as you are conceiving it. I thank you very much indeed for sharing it with us. I now hand this over to Professor Marco Gallo, who, as you heard in the introductory remarks, will accompany us to different disciplinary field, that is liturgy, that is his specialty. Marco Gallo will talk to consecrating, sacrificing, and sacra potestas. I perceive the presence of a Catholic liturgist here in a serene manner, only because today is Shrove Thursday of Carnival. I remember that a few years ago in Bonn, I was doing a week's workshop on Peterson, which started on Monday, and on Shrove Thursday, the most prominent professors appeared in masks. So they lectured about Christianity and Gnosticism in their masks. In actual fact, I think that the topic of the ritual is central to the issue of the sacred and power. If liturgy emerges to those who are barely intellectually earnest as a place where all truth meet and everything thing becomes evident. You may discuss the role that it may hold for the community, for those who don't feel welcomed. But the issue really emerges when homosexual couples ask to be blessed. In liturgy, it is evident that what we somehow say for both men and women holds no contradiction, as proven by a number of cases that we have dealt with in depth with my students during this week. And I won't repeat what we have said, but to say that we discussed an important case, sexual abuses by members of the Catholic clergy, or what happens when a Catholic dictatorship celebrates a liturgy. This can be explained better by other examples such as the one that I'm about to offer. The relationship between the mental disability and liturgy. When you study what prevents someone who is mentally disabled to feel good in a liturgy, prevent the mentally disabled from feeling good in a liturgy, and mind you, liturgy is a very therapeutical context, you will see something very impressive. What prevents a child who has autism from experiencing the Holy Mass positively? What these brothers and sisters struggle with is that they don't feel welcome, or because celebrations are not harmonious, or because the space they take place is not a space of love, or because there is an excess of words and other senses of the body are frustrated. If these hold true for autistic persons, they hold true for us. What makes you incapable of loving a liturgy is the same. The place may not smell good. So everything is visible in liturgy. In the transformations that the secular offers and in which it involves us, liturgy appears, and I'll give you two examples, as an environment where transformations are already active. My first example is the digital revolution. With digital revolution, I don't mean the use of technically super performing devices, but the fact that almost all of our society is living in a different space, a space where those who are close to me, sitting next to me at the table, can be less present of those who are far from me. And youngsters all over the world, in Ethiopia or in New York City, may perceive the same relationship to time, although they are not in contact. The technological, the digital, the infosphere is a different way of being in this world, and all of this involves every sphere we live in. Have the elections been unaffected in the United States? Where do people betray emotionally? Where do people find comfort? What comforts me at the end of a day that's so full with others? This can only be a contemporary transformation which finds its evidence in liturgy. What do I mean? I don't mean the attempt of transferring the liturgy into the digital sphere. Those who are always digital, when they enter into a church or a monastery, don't go to pre-modern times, even if the building may be pre-modern. The modern is an immersive environment, like the digital environment. So It's a markedly symbolic language is an environment with which theoretics have not yet perceived. Another transformation. Liturgy and the issue of sexual abuse perpetrated by members of the Catholic clergy. This is an event on which much literature has been written by now. And it threatens to be so relevant that it undermines the credibility of the Catholic Church in particular, but might also appear to be conniving with the language of theology and therefore even of liturgy. Let me recall that many of the abusers were fascinating theologians, effective preachers, excellent celebrants. But above all, as we have seen during this week, without a polluted language, it would have been impossible to understand why this event is so widespread in Catholic cultures that were unable to recognize evil as evil. But even here, as for the digital, liturgy is an irreplaceable resource. There where the clergy played the sacred and heroic role, the same clergy appears unbearable vis-a-vis what Paul VI demands. Remember the post-council rituals. If you didn't respect and abide by their symphonic form, whoever tried to hold on to power appeared to be totally incapable. So in the liturgical form, we need a leader, a chair, someone who is responsible, not in the form of potestas, rather in the form of munus, the gift, those who are so active and competent that their bodies are no longer visible, and instead the body of Christ appears and shines forth. We could also speak of the way in which in the secular, all institutions are struggling. The so-called traditional family, politics, political parties. You can win an election in 3 months without having been a politician before. The world of labor with the corporations which are disappearing, and the transnational churches. In the secular, we see a transformation in favor of the Pentecostalian experiences. The Christian religious is transformed in favor of environments with power, and the sacred appear in immediate and very critical forms. So sometimes I think that in the transformations of the secular, of the modern, we have not yet grasped how in the postmodern, a poor liturgy is not devoid of consequences. A good liturgy builds faith. A poor liturgy, at the same token, is not, like in closed society. You could still participate and meet the sacred in a poor liturgy. No. Today, in our democratic societies, contact with the ritual is very powerful, even awesome. And this has very important consequences. Those who are disappointed with the funeral rites will not go to a funeral again. Those who experience support in their grief and honored in their despair might perceive an opening to faith. Truly, when we think that that religion is declining or that we are in a minority, we must admit to the fact that we cannot live without rituals. In Desiderio Desideravi, Pope Francis demands of all theological disciplines to exert and strengthen their link with liturgy. My second consideration is that if this is the case, liturgy should speak above and beyond this theological cage that we are seeing in the second millennium. We know that the rituals cannot be restricted and limited to 7 fundamental sacraments and other minor sacraments. This is not enough. We need to be able to initiate others to the act of faith. There are, I think, 6 sacraments plus the Eucharist. Above all, there needs to be a wisdom where the celebrant experiences liturgy like a daily Easter time. So the liturgical act can be a fresher, more simple act that opens up even to the illiterate as well as to the already initiated. So a ritual act may be grasped as a theological place for a Christian form. Because this institute is devoted to marriage studies, let's think of marriage, the relationship between the couple's love and ritual. Those who are in a relationship have rituals, all have rituals, secret names, calendars, and they structure their time in terms of reconciliation, rest, dreams, and surrender. The relationship between love and liturgy is very close indeed, way beyond what the sacramental theology can offer. My third and final consideration is my farewell, but also a beginning. We said the liturgy is the environment where everything becomes visible. So if an assembly feels good, it celebrates in a certain way. If someone is in a hurry, you can tell immediately. In secular time, I think that the common language amongst the few initiates and the many sisters and brothers that we are living with in the digital world is surprisingly ancient, and it lies in the biblical gesture of blessing. And the books of blessings here really do not grasp this ancestral gesture in a poor manner, in an inadequate manner. Paul VI, when he was asked to justify why the world was still waiting the reform of liturgy, he said, we need to start from liturgy. We can only start from liturgy because in liturgy we say that we love God first and foremost. And from liturgy we learn that we are not the center. With liturgy, we find the reason why there is a church in the world, that is that the mute language of being may turn into an act of gratitude, which is serious but also serene. The word of gratefulness in liturgy. There are words that we cannot tell ourselves. We cannot bless ourselves. We cannot say these things to ourselves without the proper recognition. Nobody can live. So the role of liturgy in a healed community which has learned the value of the word and of discretion can be not only precious, but even tasty, like salt. Remember who mentioned salt? Thank you, Professor Gallo, for these deep words that invite us to adopt, to be able to grasp the sense, the meaning of depth and length in terms of time. I will now turn this over to Professor Sequeri, who will interact with the other panelists. And I should like to thank again Professor Sequeri as the director of the Gaudium et Spes chair for organizing this Visiting Professors Week, and therefore also organizing this conference. Thank you very much. The things that have been said here would invite us to dwell, because we've heard some very creative inputs for our minds, and I should not like to waste all of this, but I need to do my share and say something so that I show that I'm not all that ignorant. I have organized the course after all. So right now, I'm not introducing the course, so I'm not speaking as a theologian. I have 4 points to be very brief, 4 focal points. First, I want to focus on the crucial importance of this issue, whatever you think of it, the sacred and power. Karl Jasper's Axel site meant that at some point in history, religions and cultures were involved in a turning point. What turning point? The birth of the individual subject. Religion and culture were no longer just a tradition to carry forward, but as an issue of responsibility, the issue of the person, of decision, of our relationship to God, and not just the sacred tradition. Perhaps our Axel site is showing that the crux of our main problems is the relationship between the power and the sacred. We used to think that it was in the past, but Hans Joas rightly said that this is being transformed and that will lead us into the future. So the issue here is the issue of values. The challenge is now that something that does not have a credible value is of no value. Even law has no value, even religion has no value, unless it is a measurable, credible value. This is the challenge, and perhaps we're getting there, but of course there is a lot of conflict, sometimes war. Power and the sacred is also a topic of civil conflict within nations and within churches. The current problem of the church, from the sexual abuses to the form of the communities, the synodality, communion, is an issue of relationship between power and the sacred. We are realizing that we are unprepared to manage it, to think it even. So this recommends and emphasizes the seriousness of this topic. This is not only for intellectuals, and theologians must do their fair share. So my second point is that if this is the stake, then alas, in spite of the crucial importance of this issue, we have a theology which is still very generic concerning the sacred. We have general considerations of on the holy and the sacred, as if changing words could help us out of problems. We were a bit scared when anthropologists said, you know, the sacred is means sacrifice, archaic religions that sacrifice human beings, that force people in a despotic way. Catholics then said, oh, no, 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 we don't want to do that. So they said, we're not for the sacred and we're for the holy. And theologians started thinking, we need to desacralize. What does that mean? When you desacralize, do you sanctify? It doesn't mean anything. Liturgy is no longer sacred but holy. Do you see a big difference there? So the words are never enough. Words are never enough. We need to take the issue seriously. And what is the issue? The issue is that when in our culture the sacred has become a noun, das Heilige, and not only an adjective, the sacred, not only sacred, well, that brought a revolution in our way of thinking faith. Back in the day, in theology, we didn't have that problem. Sacred, holy, religious, devout, they were almost synonyms, meant to mean people and things who have, or that have a relationship with the supernatural, with God. Now, all of a sudden, it appeared that the sacred as a place of injunction, therefore of commandment, of power, precedes religion and exceeds religion at the same time. What is this power which precedes, this revelation of a power which precedes and exceeds religion, so does not coincide with religion? As a matter of fact, religion tries to regulate it, even sometimes to protect us from it. Well, that power is the power to enjoin, command, order, the absolutely inviolable, that must be respected and worshipped and protected, and the absolutely sacrificable, that which can be lost, can be abandoned. So this is the sacred as a noun. This is a huge power, a salvific power, because it tells us what to worship above all and what we must sacrifice. It pretends to show us the way to salvation, but it's also terribly ambivalent, isn't it? The sacred protects life. Life is sacred. But life can and should be sacrificed out of love. Honor your father and mother. Absolutely inviolable, yes. But father and mother must be abandoned, relinquished in favor of the persecuted, of the community, or of the sequel of Christ. The gospel says so, doesn't it? So in both cases, we have a sacred to protect which we need to sacrifice something. But in both cases, there is a reversal of roles. In our life, how can we decide at every turn where the inviolable is and where the sacrificable is? To decide that we need to protect life at all costs and decide that we can offer up, give up our lives in sacrifice so that someone else lives. Where is that possible? That is the big challenge. So what appears on the scene? When you think that in the life of man or the history of man, there appears this power, which is the power of the sacred, which says what is absolute value, pure value, to which everything else can be sacrificed, and other times shows what can and should be sacrificed. Well, we have discovered, or we discover, if we follow this approach, that we have the power to decide. Religions are that. The power to decide at every turn what content we give to this imperative of the sacred, how we are to interpret in our life and community what is inviolable and should be protected at all costs, and what can be sacrificed. But we have no power. We can do nothing in the face of injunction. There is no personal existence, much less a society or a community that can avoid this injunction, this commandment, or that can interpret it differently. No community can afford to be exonerated from establishing what is inviolable and designating what is sacrificable. If you don't do this, there is no society, no community, no religion, no human coexistence. This can be alluded to in an era of secularization. Benjamin says the religion of capitalism, of money, to decide that the inviolable is mammon and not God. Alas, this can be done, has been done, but you take a big responsibility when you designate something as inviolable. It's a very heavy responsibility, but sometimes we have to take that responsibility upon ourselves. Other times that inviolable is hidden. A brilliant philosopher, a bit crazy, but I like it a great deal, Slavoj Žižek, says that the inviolable is now a joy. That has the power of inviolability. Never go against this commandment. Use up all of your potential. Enjoy. It can go unnoticed, but it does the same thing and plays the same role of the sacred, without which we cannot live. Because without the designation of something inviolable, we are incapable of even doing the necessary sacrifices, and therefore the community cannot live. Third point. The first consequence in this scenario, in this context, is the need to become reconciled with or to accept not only the aesthetics of the sacred, but also the dramatics of the sacred. The sacred is pacification, but it's also struggle. It engenders values of comfort, but also values of struggle, of sacrifice, of risk. You cannot hold on to just one of the parts. The holy, the pure, the beautiful, the harmonious. You cannot only have that. You need to inhabit the ambivalence of the sacred. This is what Jesus Christ did. He inhabited it. He didn't separate himself from it. Law is necessary and inadequate. So to internalize, to integrate the idea of the sacred as an ambivalent commandment, which needs to be decoded, deciphered, interpreted. Religions should do that, but also cultures, societies, politicians, they must take upon themselves this responsibility. But secular society doesn't want to take on this responsibility, the responsibility for the sacred. And this is the reason why the society is sinking, is collapsing. To accept this responsibility, we need to accept. We've said that the sacred is ambivalent, it has its aesthetics and its dramatics. We must seek salvation, but we cannot excuse ourselves. The most expert subject in history to do this is religion. The most expert player is religion. But how can a society which seeks to remove religion and theology then decode the sacred, the power of life and death that still is at work within it, and establishes what must be absolutely worshipped and what must be sacrificed. You know, there are technicians that calculate that 20% of human loss is acceptable if we manage to convert wheat into a fuel. They are deciding to sacrifice somebody. They contradict the inviolability of human life in favor of the progress of a certain portion of mankind, which is more privileged. This is something that you find in the economy textbooks. It's not something so exotic. So a society that relinquishes theology and therefore has no expertise in the ambivalence of the sacred, and this is not a shallow matter of being good. I mean real theology. A society that relinquishes real theology. How can a society such as that live? Theology knows how to interpret the sacred. Theology knows all of the devious ways in which the sacred dresses up as sanctity, as law. Remember Jesus and the Pharisees. This sacred works against the salvation of God, the love of God, welcomes the Samaritan, the poor man, the disenfranchised, the sinner. Theology is an expert in all of these disguises of the sacred, because religion has always been dealing with this subject matter. And theology has become an expert concerning itself, concerning theology. It has experienced its own weakness, its own limits. My final point is my proposal. Theology says if we want to restore a cultural strength and power to the theology of religious experience and to the interpretation of the power of the sacred, of its forms and manifestations, whether they are religious or non-religious, we might look at the form of the kerygma of Jesus, which is typically the invention of a religious critique of religion as a fundamental, permanent element of faith. Critique of religion by religion. Religiously criticizing the name of God, asking God for the ability to penetrate. You see, faith lives as long as religion can criticize itself, not be abandoned, as Barthes said. But in order to remain that space where we experience the ambivalence of the sacred. And for this critique of religion, the Christian community today lacks not only adequate theology, a theology that can interpret faith in connection to credible values, by deciphering the ambivalence of the sacred inside and outside of the church. In order to do so, theology needs a community which gradually turns from the caretaker of the injunction, turns into the witness of intercession. But we say, the modern world, there is relativism, we're pushed towards materialism, to the empire of enjoyment. This is the role that the caretaker of the injunction is, and this is necessary but not sufficient. It simply brings to light the power of the sacred. So where is intercession? Old Testament, we're in the desert. Exodus. The golden veil crisis takes place. The worshipable is the golden veil and no longer God. Terrible perversion. God tells Moses, enough already. I've had enough of you. Let's leave these people in the desert, and Moses, you come with me, and we start over, and I'll make a new great people, a great new people. Moses replies, Mr. God, excuse me, but if you abandon these people, you will not have me. Yes, they are hard-headed, But if you abandon them, I will not follow you. In the olive grove, Jesus does this. Does the church do this in the modern society? Does the church say, God, we are blockheads, but if we abandon us, if you abandon postmodern society, that you deprecate, that you condemn, that's full of Canaanites and publicans and Samaritans. I mean, a church that starts showing and telling God, God, please don't abandon these in the desert, in the wilderness. Take me instead. I will take all the, the guilt and the fault upon myself, but don't abandon them, because otherwise I will take this collar off. If you abandon them, I cannot follow you, God. Don't you think that this would be the right theological way for the church to address the issue of the ambivalence of the sacred that troubles us so much today? Thank you for listening. Thank you, Don Sequeri, Don Pierangelo, for these words that are always so expressive and so disturbing in a way. They offer us an opportunity to continue the reflection of our professors in dialogue. We have some time for discussion to react to what we have heard, to ask for clarification, explanation from all our panelists. So raise your hand, introduce yourself. A roving microphone is going to be brought about to put questions and ask for clarifications. Thank you. If there are no questions, may I go back myself to the final issue of Professor Sequeri's contribution. Professor Sequeri was discussing the witnesses of intercession. And I now am reminded of Michel de Certeau, who really deals with this issue of not without you. Without you, it's impossible. De Certeau underscores in a passage that this phrase is dual. It can express a declaration of faith and a declaration of love. It is a declaration of faith, not without you, but it's also the essence of a declaration of love. Lovers say to each other, I cannot live without you. I cannot be without you. So there's a dual negation that invites a proposition, which is possible. How can we then reread the space of the ritual? Not without you, celebration in the absence, but keeping into account the absence, was one of the issues that were raised by the pandemic. How this not without you act in the context of the recreation of communities of faith in light of all the social and political transformations that Professor Joas discussed. So, Professors Joas and Gallo, here's my proposal for you to, comment on and discuss. Professor Giovagnoli, I really wish to thank the three panelists for the very important things that they told us. And I should like to put all three the same question. What you told us can what you told us be understood in connection with the war, this unbearable wound, which is war? I was rereading Albert Schweitzer's text where he said that war is proof to the failure of Christianity. If there is war, it means that Christianity has failed. but this is holds true for politics, not only for Christianity. So for the secular world as well. What is the relationship, you think, between the war and what Professor Sequeri was saying, and reminded me of Carlo Maria Martini, who said that the Christian's position when there is a war is the position of intercession. I'm asking the liturgists, what is the connection, the possible connection between liturgy and war? How can liturgy be the place where we can find an answer? And the universal, how do universalisms react to war? This is for Professor Joas, excuse me.
We have very different possibilities for our discussion on the table right now. And it's difficult to decide where exactly to start. But maybe I start with your contribution. I'm very deeply interested in the topic of war. And if you allow me to mention that, I've written 2 books on war. In English, one is War in Modernity, and the other one, War in Social Thought, from Hobbes to the Present. For me, the study of war and of large-scale violence is the companion to the study of the formation of our values. That may sound strange, but I think that on the one hand, we have positive experiences of something that is self-evidently good and so on. And on the other hand, we have the experience that something done to us, for example, a violent act against us, is clearly evil and something that should not happen. Now, among the aspects of this axial age is also, I would say, the first time in human history that the idea comes up to act non-violently. To, even if you are treated in a violent way, maybe the original message of Jesus is not to resist in violent ways. So an ethos of non-violence, not just out of being a cowardly or something like that, but an ethos of a non-violent resistance and of a principle of a non-violence. Now, this has its own dialectic, because some people will say, but if we don't resist violently, we act irresponsibly. Martin Luther, I think, made the remark that you as a Christian are allowed to decide, I will never use violence, even if I'm attacked and so on. But if you are together with a child, that was his example, and the robber threatens you and the child, isn't it irresponsible from you to decide not to resist by using violence and so to sacrifice, in a different sense now, the child? Which means that again and again, violence is praised as an ideal for the future, but justified in the present as something that should be used now to bring about a world without violence. As you may know, in the First World War, the American president Woodrow Wilson said, so to speak, this is the last war. Our purpose of intervening into the war is to bring about a world without violence. I think that is a pressing topic today. For example, in connection with human rights, the question, if we realize that there is a country where human rights are not respected, does anybody have the right to intervene militarily in that country to bring about a respect for human rights? And even if you may abstractly say yes, I think the specific question is, but can this not very easily be misused again? So that a strong power says we intervene there for the sake of human rights, but the true agenda is not exactly that. So we live in a world with violence, and the crucial question is, what do we derive from an ethos of non-violence for the sinful world in which we are? And how do we understand the mechanisms that lead to wars and the consequences of wars in the same theoretical framework, so to speak, that we use for the understanding of the dynamics of religion? And I will not say more about that now, but just take up the question, but show how extremely complex it becomes when you deal with it in the framework that I have suggested here. But if the moderator allows me, I would like to ask a question to Marco Gallo. Is that possible? Yeah. Because it's really not just a question for this panel, so to speak, yeah? But you are the expert. And the more I have been thinking, the expert on liturgy and Christian rituals, the more I have been thinking about the moral universalist character of the Catholic Church, of Christianity and of the Catholic Church, yes. The more I have started to think what this means, not only for the organizational structure of the church, that the church is a global church and all that, and that its message is for all people in the world, not just for the members of a particular people, but what that means for the rituals of the church. So to what extent could we say, for example, the crucial position of the Eucharist is itself an expression of the moral universalism of the church? And I say that with one additional thought in the back of my mind, and then I ask for your answer, namely, all religions have rituals, but the main purpose of these rituals, I would say, from a sociological point of view, is to socially integrate the community of those who share this religion. But Christianity, as a morally universalist religion, cannot be satisfied with that. So the cult cannot just be a unification of those present in the cult. like you could say maybe about religious cults in the polis, forms a unity of the citizens of the polis. But in Christianity, you have the paradoxical challenge, I think, to bring the believers that are present together, maybe also bring them together through assuming that the same ritual takes place everywhere in the world among other Christians, with other Christians, but to retain the importance of a transcending of every specific community in the cultic practice. And so that would interest me enormously, what you, as an expert in that field, say to that, let's say, universalist dimension of the cultic practice of Christianity.
Ecco, molto brevemente, perché le tre cose suggerite sono veramente intriganti, e concluderò con l'ultima.
Everything is very intriguing here. I should like to try to be very concise. Not without you, the declaration of faith and love. I would have liked to ask Professor Sequeri why he thinks that we are unable to be intercessors, but rather guardians. I see a posture of concern in the church, which is experiencing this transformation without any serenity. This is the consequence. Someone who is concerned cannot take on that posture, that attitude. Think about it. It can be difficult to live in a church such as in the 13th century, where 1/3 of all males were monks. Now we're looking at something which is extinct, and this carries a weight. If you translate this into your concern, in liturgy, you will be resentful, you'll be very worried and not serene. Quite extraordinarily, certain books in the Bible spoke differently, or sounded different in the time of pandemic. Exodus spoke to us a great deal. Professor Giovagnoli, as I was listening to Professor Joas, who spoke about human rights and war, so I want to thank you for bringing up these points again. Book of Revelations, prophets were widely quoted. Prophecy, the dream of mankind without weapons. We should notice that wars had a lot of religion. We have seen the schisms between the Russian and Ukrainian church. Alongside with that, war has a lot of rituality. Remember the camouflage uniforms? They were created so that soldiers could evade, escape. There is no organization that cannot adopt strong rituality. So, liturgy should be read. We should say that we should ask whether a community can celebrate its ritual, its Eucharist, without integrating the intercession for those who are fighting in a war, and ask for forgiveness. Kyrie eleison, says mankind. You must recognize your guilt. The Schuldsaga, said Jaspers, the liturgy has many consequences in war. Also interesting is to see how Christian rituality and moral universalism. We in class we mentioned the fact that the impossibility of celebrating the Eucharist led the Chilean bishops to completely upturn and revise their stance vis-a-vis the dictators. Someone knocks on the door while the bishop and the seminarians are celebrating the Eucharist. Someone knocks on the door, and perfectly unknown. He says they're about to torture me. He could be a spy. What does the community do? They know about spies. They say they don't open their door, but they send the person, they address this person to a house. They start the celebration, and one of the seminarians says, enough, we can no longer celebrate. Because the Eucharist is a gesture that asks us invariably what body is celebrating. A body that is not there. When we celebrate, we have the bones of martyrs underneath our altars because we believe in the resurrection. This person, this martyr is alive in Christ, and the community is both diachronic and synchronic. When I am in prison and I pray and I celebrate the Eucharist, I am actually within a body that I cannot see. Even the community with empty churches celebrates the Eucharist by inserting itself in a larger body. Interesting. The Eucharist remains an act which is also a condemnation, as St. Paul says, a condemnation of the community. Finally, quite impressively, a study in the 20th century, Schurman's study, shows that there are 32 banquets by Christ in the Gospel, and we only address the Last Supper. What's so typical to those 32 banquets before and after Easter? The risen Christ cooks fish. So what's typical of all those banquets? Someone sits down and converts. After eating, they said, there is the man who eats with sinners. And someone tells the others, having eaten with him, I see that things are now different. Simon the leper, after eating, he left, and it was night. If you domesticate, you tame the sacred, there is no salvation for you. The Eucharist contains an obligation to discernment. If you sit there without understanding, and that is the body of Christ, there is no salvation for you. If you corrupt and betray all your life, you don't really live. So this is a strong point in Christian rituals. A ritual gesture that has very low rituality. A teenager will tell his mother, I'm not coming to Mass because it's boring. The mother should say, you have understood everything, you're a great theologian. The Eucharist cannot be exciting because, like all affects, it's delicate. potentially even boring, because for Christ, what's really important is for those who come to celebrate to be free to resist the ritual. If you force someone to love, then that is not love. So our position may be weak, but the practice is stronger than our awareness.
Cosa vuoi che aggiunga io?
What could I possibly add to that? I told you
Non so come si traduce in inglese, ma comunque,
there is a lot here
faccio
that we can think about
onorare, diciamo,
to honor
l'impegno.
their commitment. I'll just add something.
Sì, guardate, questo
I'll start from the not without you or never without you.
la legge è necessaria ma non sufficiente.
The law is necessary but not sufficient. If there's only law, we're lost. If there's intercession, we're saved, and we can then appreciate the law that protects the community, prevents it from crumbling. We have no words of tenderness for this postmodern society that we are blaming for everything. Jesus didn't do that with the adulteress, with the Samaritan, with Zacchaeus. And in the current world, there are a lot of good people. It's not like Nineveh. So, the idea that we can measure the priest or the apostle or the missionary, I mean, he is credible if he considers himself to be sacrificable. If he only thinks that he's inviolable, that's very dubious, very suspicious. But if he thinks of himself as sacrificable for us, then the Eucharist is true, even if the priest is, well, a sinner like everybody else. So it's a very strategic form of balance. It would be good to find the way to insert this into the pastoral care and even the theology. When I was in the seminary and I was trying to educate young seminarians, I often use this parable. I am a sinner, I am weak, I may be scared, but I hope, and I was thinking of the night in the Olive Grove, the day that the guards come to me, I hope I will have the courage to tell the guard, take me, and I will lock you up in that room. And you will tell me, but we are the lay witnesses. I'll tell the guard, don't listen. All of what they say, I taught them, so take me. As Jesus said, whoever doesn't recognize me in front of my Father, I don't know who that is. But when the real moment comes, he says, take me. Can we tell God, take me, instead of these mothers and fathers and children of the postmodern? Take me. And try to set these people back on the road to goodness. I don't hear the church and priests confessing these things. And this is worrisome, because this shows that there is a lack of the right theology that can reconcile us with the issue of the sacred and power. It has a lot of destructive manifestations. Secondly, parables. When Jesus starts saying the parables of the kingdom and then adds judgment. First, he starts from the aesthetics. Kingdom is a pearl, is a treasure, is a banquet. But then he goes to judgment, and judgment is very harsh. You know what the subject of judgment in parables is? Jesus does not do what the master of parables does. We think that the king or the master is God and we are the laborers. No, 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 no. That's not true. Look at Jesus. The parables end by saying, and he will be chased out. Did you ever hear or see Jesus do or say something like that? We keep going, explaining the parables in our own superficial way. He who hid the talents was right, because that man in front of him is crazy. It's the Lord of the law, and the parable is addressed against the mediators of religion who are there listening. They should be encouraged. They are using the sacred only for its portion of power, the power of ordering, commanding, enjoying. They obtained the vineyard and they took it for themselves. They are punished by the Lord of the law that they have preached. This is the structure of the parable. You should listen to the parable and then look at Jesus and say, Jesus is showing me something else. It's a different movie to the movie of the parable. The movie has a title, Intercession. Samaritan is sacred, the poor man is sacred, the secret of justice is sacred. This makes the injunction credible, not by just showing the signs of the injunction that protects Samaritans and publicans. He shows that the injunction is symmetrical or overlaps with the act of intercession. I don't care that they say that I'm eating with sinners. I will eat with them. That's intercession. God cannot mistreat them because I am eating, I'm dining, I'm supping with them. As to war, it would be great if we could leave all this game of black and white behind and we had a collective injunction, not to politicians, but to intellectuals. Discuss what is inviolable to you. The honor of the fatherland? There is one who attacked unjustly and the other has been attacked. And both say, I am doing this for the honor of my fatherland. This is not enough. Values do not become credible because they are declared to be inviolable. From now on, you must become convincing, persuasive. If you oblige intellectuals to speak and speak so much, in the end they betray themselves, give themselves away. They don't care about the children and women killed in the war. Politicians will only say appropriate things we should create a fora to discuss these things, these connections between the sacred and power. I'm afraid our time is up. One more question.
I heard tonight. Of course, it's a poor attempt. I will start with Eric Peterson, who is saying that there is something mysterious in the nature of power. Power demands to be worshipped. So, which power, the question is? And if we go back to Carl Schmitt, the power is the power to distinguish between friend and enemy. And this power is creating wars. However, if we listen to Professor Sequeri, we need to go before that to the pre-political, the distinction between the true power to decide is to decide between what is to be worshipped and what is to be sacrificed. In this attempt, the church might contribute to discern that the only thing that can be sacrificed, it's our own body, the body of the church, for each of us, our own body. This is the only thing that can be sacrificed, actually.
Non so se c'è bisogno di volete una reazione veloce, ma la prendiamo appunto come un intervento.
Well, a quick reaction. I must conclude this afternoon. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank the translator. Tomorrow, we will bid farewell to our two professors, visiting professors. Thank you.